St. Louis, Missouri. Known as the Gateway to the West, it's notable for a few reasons. From the Gateway Arch, the classic blues, and of course, the St. Louis Ram. Oh wait. To say that St. Louis is one of the most important cities in the state of Missouri is an understatement. But the city has also had a pretty lengthy history of tornadoes as well. While areas closer to downtown haven't seen an intense tornado since 1959, the northwestern side of the city can't seem to get a break. Most recently was the costly twister on May 16, 2025, which caused $1.6 billion in damages, becoming one of the costliest tornadoes in US history. The tornado was rated EF4, which begs the question, when was the last time the St. Louis area was hit by a violent tornado? Well, you don't have to go back very far. In fact, it was during the most active month for tornadoes ever recorded in US history, and it's quite overshadowed by the most infamous outbreak of that year. On April 22nd, 2011, Good Friday, a violent EF4 twister tore through the northern side of St. Louis, Missouri, impacting the communities of Maryland Heights, Bridgeton, Edmondson, Berkeley, Ferguson, Delwood, Riverview, amongst other areas. The twister directly struck the St. Louis Lambert International Airport, sending people into panic as it struck. Yet, despite the fact that it was a violent tornado that hit one of the most notable metro areas of the Midwest, it's one of the more forgotten tornadoes of the 2011 season. Regardless, I feel like it's important to cover it 15 years after the event. So today, I'll be taking a deep dive into the 2011 St. Louis EF4 tornado. I'll be covering the synopsis, the events as they happened, the aftermath and response, and how the impacted areas are doing today. Welcome to Nature's Fury. In the mid to upper levels of the atmosphere, a large band of west-southwesterly flow associated with a developing mid-level cyclone over the Dakotas moved to the east-northeast. Within the band of strong flow were multiple shortwave troughs. Closer to the surface, as the cyclone over the Dakotas developed, a secondary area of low pressure over Kansas and Oklahoma moved to the east, with an associated cold front and soon warm front moving to the east alongside it. The expectations for the event were as follows. Throughout the morning, an MCS from the day prior would move through Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana. In the wake of the storms, a boundary layer would warm and moisten from Oklahoma and Arkansas into Missouri and Illinois, with lapse rates remaining steep. The steep lapse rates would provide a cap for a while before surface-based thunderstorms would fire along the cold front and warm front, in an environment with high instability and shear. Given the deep layer flow and shear vectors would be somewhat parallel to the boundary, the most probable scenario appeared to be for semi-discrete supercells to fire along the frontal boundaries, with the main threats being strong winds, large hail, and a few tornadoes, with the tornado threat being more favorable along the warm front in particular. The storms would soon grow upscale and congeal into line segments, bringing the risk of damaging winds as the system moved eastward. So, what did our numbers look like? At the 500 millibar level, there was 50 to 65 knots of west-southwesterly flow in our area of focus. Normally, I don't look at the 700 millibar level in these videos, but I feel like it's important here. Mainly because between 22 and 23Z, you can clearly see the shortwave troughs located in southern and central Missouri. At the 850 millibar level, there was 35 to 45 knots of west-southwesterly flow, with it being stronger in southern Missouri. Effective bulk shear ranged from 50 to 60 knots, and storm relative helicity values were generally between 200 to 400 meters squared per second squared, peaking at around 600 meters squared per second squared when the tornado was ongoing. As for instability, there was plenty of it. 1,000 to 2,000 joules per kilogram of mixed layer CAPE, and lapse rates were adequate, being between 7 to 8 degrees Celsius per kilometer. Now that we have more broader analysis done, let's dig into some soundings. NWS St. Louis doesn't do balloon soundings, so the closest we got for observed soundings is the 0Z sounding from Peoria. There isn't any surface CAPE, but there is plenty of mixed layer CAPE. Lapse rates from the 3 to 6 kilometer layer were also good at around 7 degrees Celsius per kilometer. Temperatures were also a bit on the cooler side. The reason for this is that Peoria was north of the warm front. Looking at the photograph, it doesn't look too bad either. The winds are back southeast at the lowest levels with good directional low-level shear. The sounding at Springfield, Missouri, which we know was south of the front, looks better from a thermodynamic standpoint, with plenty of surface instability, mixed layer CAPE approaching 4,000 joules per kilogram, and lapse rates were good as well. The hodograph does look worse in comparison to the Peoria sounding. Before jumping into the main sounding I want to discuss, I want to thank Jim Tang and Chaser Archive for letting me use their website to get this sounding and for giving me permission to show it to you all. This is the Ruck model guidance sounding for St. Louis at 1Z. Couple of keynotes. This was not observed and is just based on model guidance. But if you look at the sounding more in depth, you realize the environment the storm was in was very volatile. Comparing it to the Mesoanalysis Archive, it's pretty similar to what was observed. There was plenty of instability with mixed layer CAPE being at nearly 2,700 joules per kilogram, and the lapse rates between the 3 to 6 kilometer layer were good too, at 7.8 degrees Celsius per kilometer. The hodograph was what you would want to see when looking for tornadic supercells, a curved shape with high curvature from the surface to the 1 kilometer level. Effective bulk shear was near 50 knots, with nearly 600 meters squared per second squared of effective storm relative helicity. A very sheared environment with plenty of instability. If a supercell could take advantage of that environment, it would be bad. And unfortunately, we saw what this environment would soon produce. The SPC had been keeping an eye on this event for a few days before it happened. On April 20th, the Storm Prediction Center issued a slight risk for the Day 3 outlook from north-central Texas into portions of the Ohio River Valley, including a hatched 30% risk for severe weather from northeastern Oklahoma northeastward to eastern Missouri, with the outlook mentioning the threat of supercell thunderstorms that could soon become line segments. The Day 2 outlooks had slight risks for mostly the same areas, with the hatched 30% contour expanding eastward in both outlooks. There was a bit of uncertainty regarding how the afternoon and evening event would unfold due to storms in the morning. On April 22nd at 12:51 a.m., the Storm Prediction Center issued a Day 1 slight risk from central Texas up through portions of western Ohio, with a 5% tornado risk for parts of Arkansas, Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, and Kentucky, a 30% wind risk for the same area, and a 30% hatched hail risk for most of the slight risk. At the next outlook, the 5% contour was expanded to the southwest, now including parts of Oklahoma and more of Arkansas, and the hatched 30% hail risk no longer included parts of Texas. At the 20Z outlook, a moderate risk was introduced for a 45% hatched risk of large hail for portions of Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Missouri. Also during this outlook, a 10% tornado risk contour was introduced for portions of Arkansas, Missouri, and Illinois. At the 1Z outlook, the moderate risk was expanded to include portions of Illinois and more of Missouri, due to the expansion of the 45% hatched hail risk. The 30% wind contour was expanded to the southwest as well, and the 10% tornado risk was shrunk to only include portions of Missouri and Illinois. Despite the forecasts, nobody could have imagined what this setup would end up producing. Throughout the morning of the 22nd, a line of storms moved through portions of Missouri and into Illinois, producing severe winds as it moved through the area. Following the storms, skies remained cloudy for a while up until noon, where visible satellite imagery showed that the skies were beginning to clear up in portions of Missouri, and it wouldn't take long before the supercell behind the most violent tornado of the night would form. At 1:04 p.m., the Storm Prediction Center issued a mesoscale discussion concerning central and southern Missouri, stating the storm mode would start with supercells before evolving into line segments. The cap would erode after 21Z, allowing for surface-based storms to develop along the cold front. With 8 degrees Celsius per kilometer mid-level lapse rates, vigorous updrafts with 40 to 50 knots of effective shear would yield supercells with initial development, with the strongest low-level turning expected closer to the warm front. Shortly after 3 p.m., a cell fired in west-central Missouri, moving to the east, forming close to the triple point, and moving parallel to the orientation of the warm front. At 3:35 p.m., a tornado watch was issued for portions of Missouri and Illinois. By 4:15 p.m., a severe thunderstorm warning was issued for winds of 60 miles per hour. Just 25 minutes later, a tornado warning was issued for Tipton, Jamestown, and California. Looking at it on radar, you could see the obvious couplet despite it being far away from the St. Louis radar. At 5:21 p.m., the Storm Prediction Center issued another mesoscale discussion concerning the threat for severe weather for this region, outlining that the area within the pink contour would contain the best low-level shear for tornadoes. Storms approaching this area were already showing strong rotation, and it was expected to continue as the cells encountered greater low-level shear to the east, with the possibility of isolated strong tornadoes. The storm continued to the east, not producing tornadoes despite the very impressive appearance on radar. As the storm passed to the south of Wright City and Forrestal at 7:17 p.m. Central, the supercell produced its first tornado, a short-lived EF4 twister that struck near Newmel before lifting to the southwest of Dardenne about 10 to 15 minutes later, and making a very close call to NWS St. Louis. As the storm passed through the radar, the tornadic circulation tightened, as cells to the south formed and merged with the already existing supercell, and the primary supercell latched onto the warm front. And as the cell moved over Maryland Heights, it dropped the strongest tornado of the day. At 7:59 p.m. Central Daylight Time, a twister touched down on the northern edge of Creve Coeur Lake, traveling to the east at about 40 miles per hour, and almost immediately the tornado began to produce significant damage in areas around Maryland Heights, snapping wooden power poles and ripping roofs off of homes. As it crossed over Fifi Creek and into a neighborhood, it intensified further to EF3 strength as it destroyed most of a home off of Jeanette Mary Drive at 801. Continuing through the neighborhood, it produced extensive damage to trees and lifted the roofs off of homes. Damage became more inconsistent as it crossed over Interstate 270 near 8:03 p.m., and into the southern part of Bridgeton, producing EF1 to EF2 damage. That was until it passed near Old St. Charles Road at 8:04 p.m., where it rapidly intensified to EF4 strength, wiping a home off of its foundation and tearing other homes down without any walls remaining, with winds maxing out near 170 miles per hour. The twister kept its EF3 intensity for a while as it hit homes in the neighborhood and hit a power building off of I-70. The next target in this tornado's path was the St. Louis Lambert International Airport. With the storm having been warned for at least half an hour before it struck the airport staff should have been able to warn people and get travelers to safety before the twister struck. The key word there is being should. As it turns out, the Airport Operations Center was unaware there was a tornado on the ground despite the supercell being warned for about half an hour. Airport procedures stated that they were to announce weather warnings in the airport terminal, but for the concourses, it was up to each airline to have their own emergency plan. However, it seemed like, despite there being plans in place, they weren't activated. Many airport patrons commented they received no information on the storm whether they were in the main terminal or in a concourse. This extended to the Lambert Field Tower, which wasn't evacuated until 8:08 p.m., when the manager for the FAA there called to convey the warning she saw on TV. They evacuated 2 minutes before the twister struck the airport. The end result of the lack of preparation was complete and utter chaos. While I cannot show most of the videos from this event, there are a plethora of videos online of people sitting and waiting for their planes, only to hear the wind picking up followed by the glass shattering in front of them. It wasn't until the last moments when travelers got any idea that they should evacuate and seek shelter. Witnesses such as Ross Taylor stated to CBS News that there was glass and blood everywhere due to people being cut. Corinne Hennessy was seated in a plane connected to the gate when the tornado struck. The twister picked up the plane and moved it about 20 feet. Thankfully, nobody was injured on the plane. Notably, security camera footage at the airport caught the twister coming in. At the terminal, the lights quickly go out as the twister starts to hit the airport, and people rush to cover through a hallway as the twister roared through the airport, with staff coming out shortly after the tornado came through to inspect the damage. Overall, damages at the airport range from $35 to $40 million. After hitting the airport at EF2 intensity, The twister continued eastward, hitting homes in Berkeley before its intensity became more inconsistent, ranging from EF1 to EF2 strength. It moved through the northern side of Ferguson at around 8:15 p.m. and into Delwood shortly after, downing trees and causing extensive roof damage. The twister moved into the Riverview area around 8:20, and soon crossed over the Mississippi River and into Illinois around 8:24 p.m. Damage was minimal up until it crossed State Highway 203 and into areas south of southwestern Illinois College, producing EF2 damage to homes off of Dawn Plain, and shortly after, it quickly weakened and lifted near Pontoon Road at 8:31 p.m. The St. Louis EF4 tornado was on the ground for 32 minutes, traveling 21.3 miles with a peak width of a half a mile, and estimated peak winds of 170 miles per hour. The tornado caused 5 injuries, no deaths, and at least $250 million in damages. As the supercell moved into Illinois, the storm began to weaken, likely because the secondary low began to occlude and race to the north, with the warm front moving northward alongside it. The supercell would produce one last tornado, an EF2 twister just outside of Highland, Illinois. After producing this tornado, the cell would weaken and dissipate over south-central Illinois. The cell directly to the south of the main supercell produced 2 tornadoes, an EF2 in Waterloo, Illinois, and an EF1 in Paderborn, Illinois. As for the tornado threat in other states, there were 15 tornadoes that I didn't mention. 7 in Oklahoma, 3 in Arkansas, 1 in southeastern Missouri, 3 in Kentucky, and 1 in Indiana. As for the hail risk, the majority of the large hail fell in Oklahoma, northeastern Arkansas, and southern Missouri, with additional large hail coming from the St. Louis supercell. In total, there were 202 hail reports, with 35 of them being for hail larger than 2 inches in diameter, and 59 wind reports, with 2 of those being for significant gusts in excess of 65 knots. The largest hail recorded from the event was 4.5 inches in diameter in Warrenton, Missouri, and the strongest non-tornadic wind gust was 80 miles per hour in St. Peters, Missouri. Regardless of the severe weather elsewhere, all the focus was on St. Louis, and the damage left behind from the strongest tornado to hit the area since 1967. Following the storms, first responders quickly got on scene to respond to the damage. There were so many reports of damage to 911 that the service became overloaded for a while. Meanwhile, at the airport, the FAA closed it at around 8:30. However, the extent of the damage wasn't really well known due to the darkness of the night. But come the next morning, it was blatantly obvious as to what had occurred. While there aren't a ton of images of the damage from NWS St. Louis, I will do my best with them in the descriptions from the Damage Assessment Toolkit and their storm summary from the Storm Events database. Damage started in Maryland Heights off of Creve Coeur Mill Road, with dozens of trees snapped, and almost immediately after that it began producing EF2 damage. All of the wooden power poles near the Union Pacific Railway were snapped like toothpicks, and the damage was about 1/4 mile wide. In the Rose Acres neighborhood, damage was everywhere. Homes off of Beckford Estates Drive and Josephine Mario Drive had their roofs ripped off and garages destroyed. One home off of Beckford Estates was a 2-story home with the roof and some upper-level walls removed. The worst of the damage in the neighborhood was just to the north, a home missing all of its exterior walls with its belongings laying there in the open. Throughout the neighborhood, the extent of the damage was clear. In the best-case scenario, damage to homes was limited to some minor roof damage. In the worst-case scenario, trees were toppled onto homes, with some homes sustaining major roof damage. But the worst of the damage became evidently clear after it crossed Old St. Charles Road. Trees were debarked with only the stubs of the largest branches remaining. 2 houses nearby had most of their walls collapsed. But it was one house in the middle of those 2 that sustained the worst of it. The house was completely swept down to its foundation. This is where the EF4 damage was found, and where the twister had winds of 170 miles per hour. Off of Beaverton Drive laid homes that were similarly destroyed. Some houses were better off than others. but one in particular was turned into nothing more than a pile of debris. The carnage continued off of St. Charles Rock Road, where a retail building was destroyed, and a certified power building off of I-70 had one of its cinderblock walls toppled. This is where the last of the EF4 damage was found with this tornado. At the St. Louis Lambert International Airport, the worst of the damage was at the main terminal and Concourse C. Most of the windows at the main terminal building were blown out, and at Concourse C, a large section of the roof was peeled off and all of the windows were blown out. Along 4th Avenue, many large trees had collapsed and power lines were down all along the street. The roofs of 2 homes were removed off of Jefferson Avenue, and power poles were snapped and leaning over too. The damage was more minimal and inconsistent from here on out, with the worst of it being to trees that were snapped or uprooted. On the northern side of Ferguson, damage was mainly relegated to broken windows, minor roof damage, and snapped and uprooted trees. But there were still businesses and locations that were hit harder than others. The roof of the Ferguson Christian Church was completely removed, and at Griffith Elementary School, windows were broken, large trees were snapped, and part of the roofing was removed. The Little Caesars was also missing its roof, and after the twister, thieves came in to steal copper from the air conditioner. In Delwood, damage was mostly relegated to trees and minor housing damage. An apartment building off of Chambers Road had decent roof damage, and large trees nearby were uprooted and snapped. To the east near Castle Point off of Halls Ferry Road, laid 4 large power poles that were snapped. They were 14 inches in diameter, and other electrical poles west of Halls Ferry were snapped as well. Further east off of Colin Maid Meadows Drive were 3 2-story homes that had lost their roofs. According to the damage assessment toolkit, it noted some of the walls on the second story were either pushed in or removed. Other nearby homes lost a significant part of their shingles. Numerous trees were snapped a quarter to halfway. Some of the trunks of the trees were greater than 3 feet. In Riverview, damage was limited to minor roof damage and snapped trees. After it crossed into Illinois and began moving south, damage was mostly minimal with the exception of homes off of Dawn Plain. The roof of one home was completely removed, and debris was tossed over 50 to 70 yards. Other homes had 30 to 40% of their roofs removed. Several large trees were snapped halfway up. Approximately 100 homes were damaged from Dawn Avenue southward to the next 2 blocks. Just a few homes down to the east was a home that had lost its entire roof. The walls were still standing for the brick home. Other homes nearby lost some roofing material, and numerous trees were snapped halfway up. The last area of damage was noted off of Pontoon Road and Sarah Street. A carport was destroyed and 2 others were leaning. But that was just the damage. There were also the stories of those who survived. Ron Henderson was home with his wife in the Harmon Estates neighborhood. He took shelter with his wife with seconds to spare, and then all hell broke loose as the tornado hit his home. There were also stories some of my fans told me about their close calls with the storm. Sarah Cooper's house was about 2/3 of a mile south of the tornado and was hit by the RFD. Branches were down across her area, and the house they moved in from 2004 had its garage blown out, and the house across the street where they babysat lost most of its upper story. Carrie Mills was cleaning up from the New Year's Eve tornado that hit the southwest part of the county a few months before the 2011 twister. Her family went up north to help families that had been affected by the EF4 twister, and everywhere she looked there was storm damage. A pocket monster remembered seeing the rotating mesocyclone above and getting their animals into the basement. Their mother stayed out until she felt a very weird change in the atmosphere and she decided to take shelter, which she normally never did. At the Ferguson Christian Church, 31 people were watching Passion of the Christ when the tornado struck, and church attendants sought shelter in the basement, hiding under tables and in bathrooms. Nobody was seriously hurt. Following the storms, Missouri Governor Jay Nixon declared a state of emergency for St. Louis County. And in May, President Barack Obama issued a federal disaster declaration for portions of Missouri, including St. Louis County. Charities came in after the storm to help with the recovery effort. and the community banded together to come back from the tragedy. One aspect of the recovery and response process that I feel like mentioning is how fast the airport went back to business as usual. St. Louis Mayor Francis Slay said it could take a long time to repair Concourse C, so the flights would be moved to other concourses at the airport. The airport planned to reopen on the 24th for both inbound and outbound flights, and power was restored to the airport on the evening of the 23rd. By midweek, the week following the tornado, the mayor hoped to be at 100% capacity. So, 15 years later, how are the hardest hit areas doing today? And also I want to answer why this tornado seems to have been forgotten despite what it did. On the evening of April 22nd, 2011, it seemed just like any other day. In fact, for those in St. Louis, they were all focused on the Good Friday festivities in preparation for Easter that upcoming Sunday. However, they'd remember this Good Friday for a much darker reason. That evening, a supercell thunderstorm produced a violent EF4 twister that tore through the northern side of the city, destroying homes in Maryland Heights and Bridgeton. It then moved into the St. Louis-Lambert International Airport, catching travelers and staff off guard as the twister ripped the roof off of parts of the building and shattered countless windows. The twister continued to produce significant damage as it made its way through the northern side of the city, impacting the communities of Berkeley, Ferguson, Delwood, and Castle Point. The twister ended its reign of terror after crossing into Illinois, but not before damaging homes to the south of Southwestern Illinois College. It's been about 15 years since the event at the time this video has been uploaded, so how are the hardest hit areas doing today? Let's start with tornado history. The luck with tornadoes in northern St. Louis has not been so great. 2 years after the EF4, a strong EF3 tornado tore through the northern portions of the city, mainly impacting Bridgeton, Berkeley, Calverton Park, and Larimore. There was a break from then on. Some weak tornadoes did occur in the city, but nothing major, until December 10th, 2021, where a high-end EF3 twister struck right outside of the area, lifting before reaching the Beltway. That tornado did most of its damage in St. Charles County. But for the city as a whole, it wasn't until May 16th, 2025 when the tornado luck ran out, as an intense EF3 tornado struck through parts of the city, which was south of the 2011 tornado's track. There were other significant tornadoes too, but those were the main ones I wanted to point attention to. The population in the greater St. Louis metro has remained mostly steady since the tornado, growing by about 1.2% since 2010 as of the 2020 census. Many residents have grown more resilient since then, but outside of that, I can't find much regarding the community coming back from it. However, I want to change this discussion to one about this tornado's legacy, that being how it really isn't talked about that much. This was a violent tornado that tore through the largest metro area in the state of Missouri, and yet it seems to be one of the more forgotten tornadoes of 2011. Well, there are a few reasons as to why I think this tornado is overshadowed compared to most. First of all is that there isn't really a known photo of the tornado itself. It's assumed that it was rain-wrapped for pretty much its entire life. There were storm chasers on this cell, but they never really got close enough to see it behind the rain. Well, that's what I thought. Kinda. There's a video by Storm Chaser 6389 where they were able to get close enough to see power flashes. However, you can't really see the tornado very clearly, it's rain-wrapped to hell and back. The second reason was the impacts brought. Yes, the airport damages were significant, but it wasn't like the airport was destroyed or anything. Damages were pretty high though, exceeding at least $250 million according to the NWS. But despite the high population density, the tornado didn't kill anyone and injured 5. As sad as those injuries are, the death toll was 0, and the low impact of the twister is another reason. But I'd argue the main reason people don't talk about this tornado is simply because of what happened after it. Literally 5 days after this twister was April 27th, 2011. Do I need to explain why the largest tornado outbreak in US history would quickly overtake any news about the St. Louis EF4? Then, exactly a month after the St. Louis EF4 was Joplin. Again, do I need to explain why Joplin overshadowed the St. Louis EF4? The answer is obvious. And in the grand scheme of things, those two events are more important than the St. Louis EF4. but I feel like it's kind of a disservice to write off the event as a whole, and that's why I felt compelled to talk about it. For those who were hit by the tornado in 2011, mainly in the communities of Bridgeton, Maryland Heights, Berkeley, Ferguson, Delwood, Castle Point, and many other small communities, it's a tornado and event that they could never forget. And 15 years later, it's certainly an event that I will not forget anytime soon. Special thanks to my proofreaders, those being Alto, Foxtrot, and Griff, Aster for the tornado icons I use, A Pocket Monster, Carrie Mills, and Sarah Cooper for providing their experiences with the tornado, Amberry for the VTuber model, Celtic White for being the channel artist, Zinel, Crackalek, and Cyanide Blue for letting me use their music whenever I use it, and everyone for watching. It means a lot. I am proud to announce that my next project will be on the May 16th, 2025 tornado outbreak. If you have footage from the event or the aftermath that you would like me to use in my video, you can send it to me on my socials or to my business email on screen. Special thanks to those subscribed to the channel Patreon or are a YouTube member, those being Montpelier, Phoenix, and Queen Hyena at the Ulfi's Army tier, Alto Stratamus, Michelle, Tanner, Techno Idioto, Tefu, and Worm Off the String at the Ulf Jr. tier, Bipolar Batty, Brian Hawley, Dante DMC, David R., Ellen Bryn, Esri, Foscrew, Foxtrot, Fry JC, Hannah Stormer, James Sullivan, Kara Kelly, King Shisa, Liz Swaff, Means Beans Machines, Rama, Tirani Rielta, and Van Granny at the Ulf Mini tier, and everyone listed on screen at the Ulf Supporter tier. Your support is greatly appreciated. If you wish to support the channel financially, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a YouTube member to get access to B-roll footage I've recorded, full interviews, and hopefully Patreon-exclusive documentary seminar-style videos in the future. Anyways, that's all I got. If you like the video, consider subscribing to the channel, giving the video a like, hyping the video, which I keep forgetting to tell people to do, commenting your thoughts, sharing it around, all that jazz. Also, consider following me on Twitter and Twitch, and even joining my Discord server. All of that is in the description. That being said, I'm Alferia, you all stay safe, and I'll see you all soon.